51 new deaths. I love Italy so much. It's so shocking what's happening. That's why I'm putting out all the stops I can. I'm not a frontline doctor, or I'd be there in the hospital working. I'm a planetary healer working on general systems theory, trying to understand, the bigger issue. I talk about nuclear weapons, which still are around and still threaten our peace. And if the coronavirus doesn't get us, the accidental nuclear war might. And as John Mack devoted some time to researching this, some people, like me, are still very worried about this. The statistics are there might well be a accidental nuclear war in the next 100 years. It's very likely. And when I was living up in Scotland and went to Faslane a couple of times, we had an academic protest where we had lectures and so on outside the Faslane nuclear weapons base. And the mountain where nuclear weapons are stored in the UK military system was opposite the castle where I lived for 7 years, the Castle of the Muses. It's called Coalport Mountain. It's a hollowed out mountain with all kinds of storage systems inside where they actually store the nuclear weapons, which are then put on the submarines at Faslane. And there's 1 or 2 on patrol all the time at sea. And on these submarines, and they're at sea for months on end, there's a written letter signed by the Prime Minister to be opened if that red light comes on. And the red light only flashes if it's a war footing and you've got to launch the missiles. If so, then you open the letter and it has the order, the signatory, yes, and the codes, right? And my cat seems to be about to have a drink. Oh dear. Okay, so I find that very scary. That right now, as I speak, there's a British nuclear submarine. Now, what these things are so sophisticated, they now have 50 independently targetable warheads on each submarine, each of which packs a power greater than the Hiroshima bomb, several times over, like 50 times more powerful. So that means that if that commander opens the letter and he gets the authorization, the red lights come on, and it's a fake warning, it's a flock of birds just flew over the Arctic, he could be firing 50 death and destruction bombardments of 50 cities in the enemy bloc, right, wherever that is, God knows. I dread to think, but I bet it now includes most of China, most of Russia, and most of Iran. Well, I think that's barbaric and puerile and totally anti-human. I'm a humanist and a philosopher who loves life and loves people. I mean, how many millions of people would be killed from that one submarine and that one envelope being opened? You do the maths, far more than coronavirus and far more swiftly. And then, of course, they wouldn't just take it lying down. China and Russia would see the missiles coming in and they would fire back. So that's the end of Glasgow and all the cities of the UK. That's the end of all the cities of the USA, and that's the end of Paris. I'd be all right for a few hours because I'm stuck in the absolute geographic heartland of France with no cities around, deliberately. Yeah, I don't want to live in a world where that's even possible, even thinkable. So my mission and my institute, which was founded partly by my mother, who was a fierce anti-nuclear weapons campaigner, Eileen Daffern. She worked with CND and other anti-nuclear weapons campaigns around the world, is to see nuclear weapons abolished by law in every country on the world, in my lifetime. And it's possible. The UN now has a treaty process whereby you can pledge to that. For it to happen, we have to make real peace between Israel, Iran, America, the very countries that are in the suspect firing line. Because Israel keeps its nuclear weapons because it's so paranoid it's going to be attacked by massed Arab armies that it's its weapon of last resort. And there's similar argument for the reason why all the other countries have them. Well, so the only way to solve this is to transform the terror that people feel We live on a planet of terror and fear into a planet of joy and peace, which is back to the Beatles thing, right? And we have to turn the world into a place of love and planetary peace possibility to get rid of these nuclear weapons. It's the biggest challenge of our generation, right? I still think we can do it. And that's what my newsletter is saying. It's giving hope. You know, that's where peace studies as a discipline came from, the 60s, when academics and intellectuals all over the world, particularly in the English-speaking world, in America, Canada, Britain, and so on, said we need to reform the way we work in academia so that we prioritise peace, as well as philosophy, history, sociology, economics, whatever it is we do as specialists or scientists. So there are people working away for peace within all the academic disciplines. And, you know, I've met a lot of them my colleagues, and wonderful people. I then talk about Brexit. I say that, you know, this is still the worst idea that I've known in my lifetime, politically speaking. And we have to sort of unthink it, and I give some clues as to how we can do that. I talk about creative responses to conflict, which is a group I'm involved with based in New York, but we're having online meetings, and we met again in India just now, and they're dealing with restorative circles of broken relationships. When relationships are bust and you can't speak to each other, well, what do? You have a restorative circle. I talk about a retreat I'd like to run in the south of France once this thing is all over, at a place called the Alchemy Garden, which is a wonderful thing, on the alchemy of peace. I talk about the tragic mistreatment of Julian Assange and why I think this is a moral blot on the British people for allowing it, and for allowing the elite American, you know, military, industrial, espionage establishment to insist on it. We should be standing up and saying, no way. I mean, it's just not on. This poor man, I mean, he's an Australian citizen. He's not a criminal, he's not a terrorist. He was a journalist who exposed the malpractice of the American corporate military elite in trampling over the human rights of half the planet. WikiLeaks, he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize, in my opinion, and a knighthood. And so the Queen should override the whole thing, give him a pardon. I mean, he's not even accused of anything under British law. The whole rape stuff from Sweden was manufactured and they've all been dropped. No, this is just cruel, vindictive treatment. And, you know, my Scottish friend, Craig Murray, has written up the trial so far. It's shocking, shocking stuff. I give a summary. I also talk about a new book I'm about to publish called Magical Peacemaking, a handbook of skills for practitioners and theoreticians, which I hope will raise a few eyebrows in two communities I'm in touch with. I've got a foot in both camps. Firstly, the magical esoteric community, the Druids, the Wiccans, all the esotericists, the Christian esoterics, the anthroposophical, theosophical lot. You know, there's millions of esoteric, occult, magical types around the planet, and a lot of them are my friends. You know, I think they're great people, some of them. Some of them are a bit weird and a bit dodgy, but mostly they're good. And because I'm peace officer of the Druid Council of Britain and Europe, and run a Druid peace order, I thought, well, I ought to be trying to sort of give some magical practices for peace, because there's nothing like it. There's nobody talks about peace magic. There's lots of magic for power, wealth, good sex, you know, blah, blah, you know. There's lots of how-to manuals, but nobody's actually done the how-to peace magic manual. So that's why I've done it. Secondly, it's also intended for my peace research colleagues. Now, a lot of them are quite interesting and magical people in their own right, because you don't get to be a peace scholar unless you've got, you know, a brain and a heart. I mean, just to give one story, forgive me for sharing secrets, but, you know, it's a story confided in me by a Japanese gentleman who's now very important in the Japanese peace studies community. A good friend of mine, I won't mention names, and he's still active. And he told me once, when I was living in London, starting my institute, he went to Hiroshima. He was then studying English. He was an English professor, a language professor, and he had a nice, comfortable job. He was just getting married. He was marrying his young wife. They went to Hiroshima as part of their honeymoon. And he told me that as he was walking around the grounds of Hiroshima, which is now a park, he could hear the spirits of the dead speaking to him, and that they were telling him, why on earth are you teaching English? You know, you ought to be doing peace studies, because the world, you know, we don't want the whole world to go up like Hiroshima. Anyway, he told me that as a true story. I mean, I don't doubt his word. It's very interesting. Most Japanese people are very, very spiritual. They combine Buddhist belief in the afterlife with a Shinto belief in the spirits, the animated universe of the kami, the gods, the spirits. And he was, and also now most of them are scientifically trained in some kind of Western branch of knowledge, but they haven't lost their indigenous Japanese spirituality. And so there's an example of a magical peace studies expert, if you want. And the stories of most of them have got something, like Elise Boulding and Kenneth Boulding, who were two amazing pioneers of the subject, friends of mine. Kenneth was an amazing man, a poet, an economist, and a Quaker, and a mystic, and a genius, you know. And Elise, his wife, likewise. They would have loved this handbook anyway, and there's loads of others that I've been influenced by, and who taught me my skills as a peace thinker and a peace researcher. So, you see, to me, all academic work is a kind of white magic, actually. I'm a Platonist, or Neoplatonist, and I believe that when Plato set up the academy outside of Athens and created academia, what he was doing was saying, we have to use our intellect, our mind, for finding truth. And it requires discipline. It's not just, you know, random. You have to really work at this. And that's what it means to become a proper academic. Now, to me, Plato was a great peace magician, what he was trying to do in his work. And so in the book, this magical handbook, I've quoted many great thinkers, philosophers, scholars, and saints and sages, and there's quotes. I mean, to me, Christ was a peace magician. Blessed are the pure in heart, they shall see God. You know, I quote it in one of the sections. It's instructions for a peace magician. You will only get to the absolute truth through purity of heart, which means controlling your thoughts, your mind. It's the same as Buddha's insight. Only when you calm the inner voices through meditation practice will you reach enlightenment or nirvana. Nirvana is the kingdom of God in Christian parlance. So anyway, that's going to be fun, and that's, I've taken time out to record this. I'm working on this. It'll be published within 3 days, I hope. Magical Peacemaking, a handbook of skills for practitioners and theoreticians. There's an awful lot of research and work gone into that. But I think it's gosh, you know, I wish I'd done it some time ago, because the world really needs this thing. Then I talk about the campaign against political lying. I've mentioned that. And the Green University website, which is just being redone, where lots of my talks and commentaries and so on, like the one I'm doing on the Quran, the one I'm doing on Das Kapital, on Marx's great masterpiece. I'm finding, you know, some problems with it, forgive me, but yes I am. And I talk about the mediation service and the work here at the European Peace Museum. And then I talk about the new Historical Commission for 9/11, which I'm launching, hopefully, on 9/11 this year, here in France, in the wake of the publication of the 2 volumes of my book called Prolegomena to a History of 9/11, a historical and philosophical study of 9/11. Now this is a 2-volume, 1,000-page book, which is the first comprehensive, detailed study of the events of 9/11 and all their possible explanations. I've gone into it with as much detail and fine-tooth combery as I can, as I'm trying to do with the coronavirus thing. So read it. You know, it's not an easy read, but then 9/11 was a hugely important event. And I then talk about the Nonagon Project, which is an attempt, a vision inspired by a trip to Leonardo da Vinci's grave and having a study day dedicated to Leonardo, a 9-sided building on top of the Pentagon to house the US Department of Peace. I explain the vision, what it's about, how you can get involved. And I think Leonardo would be delighted at that. Then we have a dictionary of new words for a new global peace civilization, which is another book I published last year. It's a dictionary, it's about 200 pages, and it has 100 new words I've coined. You see, I've always loved words and language since I learned to speak and fell in love with learning and learned Latin and Greek and French and all the rest of it. My mother was a linguist, a teacher of languages, and I inherited, I think, probably from her, but just from universal consciousness, a love of language. And when I discovered the Kabbalah and universal mysticism, I realized that language is the key to a lot of philosophical depth in intellectual history. And I've always been interested in etymology, so the origin of words, where they come from, is one of my big passions, right? But the other thing is, I noticed that lots of philosophers always coin new words to coin ideas that are just being, developed. So, for instance, the word the unconscious was developed by Freud and Jung to sort of mark a new territory they were exploring. The collective unconscious was coined by Jung to say, well, we're looking at this weird type of thing where our minds seem to be all interconnected and what's going on there. The word archetype was developed. It wasn't coined by Jung, he pinched it from Plotinus, but he gave it a new kind of meaning, to mean the sort of primal elemental building blocks of universal consciousness and unconscious thought. Telepathy was another word that was coined by Frederick Myers, a great pioneer in parapsychological research, and international was coined by Jeremy Bentham, a great philosopher at the University of London who helped set up my university, and so on and so on. All these words. Socialism was coined by Saint-Simon, great French intellectual, and Robert Owen, who picked it up in Britain around the same time, a Welshman from Welshpool, where I used to live. So I noted all these people are coining new words, and well, why don't we consciously coin some new words? Because we need to, jolly well get a peace civilization on this planet. So it needs a helping hand if we can coin some new words. So I've coined about 100. Perhaps the most famous or the most well-known is my concept of Sophia-phobia, which there's a little book about, which is the fear of wisdom. It's the opposite of philosophy. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. Well, Sophia-phobia is the kind of people that hate wisdom. They see me talking and they switch off or try and shoot me. Sophia-phobia can't stand what I'm talking about because, well, they think in very small terms, they stick in their little boxes. They only know like a half of one of these boxes maximum. And they shoot you if you try and, think big or look outside the picture of officialdom. So these are the kind of policemen of knowledge who stand guard on the boxes and say you can't, if you're a Roman Catholic, you can't study Buddhism. Or if you're an Orthodox Jew, you can't study Islamic Sufism or Shintoism. Well, yeah, we know those types, right? They run most philosophy departments. They run most academic departments. They're the little knowledge policemen. Well, they're Sophia-phobes, my friend, and that's why I coined the book, coined the word. So anyway, this dictionary's got loads of other interesting words, which I can't sadly go into. But I do quote a point made by Confucius, who I have great reverence for, and he coined some words too. If names are not rectified, he said, then language will not be in accord with truth. If language is not in accord with truth, then things cannot be accomplished. If things cannot be accomplished, then ceremonies and music will not flourish. If ceremonies and music do not flourish, then punishment will not be just. If punishments are not just, then the people will not know how to move hand or foot. Therefore, the wise human being will only give names that can be described in speech and say only what can be carried out in practice. I love Confucius. He is so spot on in this quote. The progression of thought, but if names are not rectified, then language will not be in accord with truth. The point is that reality is changing, things are shifting and moving, so we need new words to describe it. Like we coined words like the internet and so on. Well, thank you, but now we need new words. Like the word wisdomize. To wisdomize is to turn something into its wisdom content. So I'm saying we should wisdomize the internet. Instead of it being a cesspit of stupidity and ignorance and lies, which some of it is, we should clean it up and wisdomize it. So, coining new words, yes. If language is not in accord with truth, then things cannot be accomplished. Well, that nails on the head why I'm going for this duty of parliamentary veracity. See, if we don't have language that's in accord with truth, then things cannot be accomplished. The trouble is the Tory party have so lost the concept of truth over Brexit, which was an untruth from start to finish, that they've now compromised the entire nation's survival and capacity to endure. I've said before, publicly, that I think the Queen is implicated by her silence, because you can speak untruth through silence just as much as you can through words. I think the Duke of the Archbishop of Canterbury's silence over Brexit is complicit in allowing this national catastrophe to have happened, and that's created a climate in which untruth now flourishes, and we have a government led by a Tory party that's the most mendacious political party I've ever seen in my lifetime. So what's happening? Well, catastrophe. We have coronavirus. For all we know, it was made in Britain, and there are loads of people saying this on the internet. We don't know, because words are not in accord with truth, and therefore nothing can be accomplished. Thank you, Confucius. If things cannot be accomplished, then ceremonies and music will not flourish. Okay, so on lockdown, people are not, able to do music. When I was young, we could go down the pub and play guitars. You can't do that now. The pubs are shut. Concerts are being shut. Everything is being, eradicated because words are not in accord with truth. That's the cause of this. And if ceremonies and music do not flourish, if the people can't be happy, the entire festival season when everyone goes to Glastonbury, that's all cancelled now. No more of that. Well, gradually it'll dawn on people that the catastrophe of what's happened, and they'll realise it traces back to the untruths that we let this political class get away with for the last 10, 20 years. I date it back to 9/11. That was the big, big untruth on my watch, right? And when I realised that was all an untruth, a lot of pennies dropped, and I realised that we have been lied to systematically as a country and as a world for a good few years since 9/11, 2001, and that was nearly 20 years ago. So it's a very long time, and that's why, because music and ceremonies don't flourish, punishments are not just. In other words, the evil people are running the country, and the good people are in prison for little petty debts or whatever, fake charges, or smoking cannabis or something minor, which might bring them a bit of consciousness elevation, but which is against the law as defined by Richard Nixon and his war on consciousness programs, which the Beatles tried to pioneer a slightly more intelligent response to. But so if punishments are not just, then the people will not know how to move hand or foot. I think that's where we're at, folks. And literally, we can't even go out the door. We don't know how to move hand or foot because of this lack of truth, lack of veracity. So Confucius saw all this because he was living in a time of horror in China, the warring states era, and warlords were chasing around and doing all this stuff. We're back in a sort of planetary warlordism, where you've got Saudi Arabia's great warlords fighting Yemen, fighting Iran, fighting, everyone's a warlord, right? Enough is enough, people. Back to Confucius, and back to a dictionary of new words for a new global peace civilization, which I've authored and which I mention in this newsletter. So, I mentioned some other things. I'm not going to go into everything. I mentioned intellecting, which is a fun verb. Again, my love of language. In Abelard, the great French philosopher who founded the University of Paris, which kick-started the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, Naples, all the rest. It was the first university outside of Italy. Bologna was the first. And he talked of intellecting as a verb. It's an activity. It's not a thing. It's an activity. And it means to think deeply, to look all round an issue. That's what I've been trying to do in this short talk. It's what I do in the newsletter. I'm intellecting about the coronavirus origin. And it means to look at all the options and suspend judgment, like the Jains say. Their concept of anicant vada is you look all round a problem from every possible angle, you intellect about it, and then maybe, the answer will come. So that's what Abelard said in his book, Tractatus de Intellectibus, which was translated and somebody did a PhD on it, Peter King. I also talk about my commentary on Das Kapital, which is proceeding, and I've discovered this huge lacuna. Marx never talks about the military dimensions of capitalism. It's unbelievable. He never talks about the fact that the military is the greatest innovator of technology and therefore the driver for industrial revolution and technological change. And therefore capitalism has a sort of inbuilt desire for wars, not only to go on, but also to get increasingly sophisticated, so it can make more and more complex machinery to fight them, and therefore can, etc. So what we have to do is unthink military capitalism. Now Marx gives us some clues, but not. He doesn't even see the problem. Bless him. I mean, Marx was a bit of a dogmatist, and if I'd have met him, we would have sure had some interesting conversations, and I would have pointed out this problem. I wish I could time travel back to, Hampstead and go and meet him, or go and bump into him in the British Library where I worked myself for about 3 years on studies. So poor old Marx, no, he never got it. So what I'm trying to do is go back over Das Kapital and fill in the missing bits, say what he should have said, where. Because there are some brilliant bits, and it's really worth remembering this book, and there are bits that really make your hair stand on end with grief for the poverty described and the horrors of the impact of the Industrial Revolution on European British working class people who were suffering in unbelievable conditions of poverty. The tragedy is that, 140 years since it was published, they're still suffering in conditions of great poverty in many parts of Britain, and it's got a lot worse under these Tories who haven't got a moral brain, haven't got a brain or a morality or a heart, it seems. I mean, they just have a line that they trot out, a sort of political correctness. No, the Queen says it's all right, so it's all right. No, it's not, madam. It's not. And Marx, so I'm supplementing what he said about the problems of capitalism, but I'm pointing out this huge lacuna, which is his silence on military capitalism. And even Shoshana Zuboff, who's written a very good book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, amazingly doesn't mention militarism and capitalism, which is the main reason we have this surveillance economy, because it was all invented by military intelligence. So I don't know what Zuboff is up to, but really I think her book needs a second edition with another 100 pages on military intelligence and its contribution to surveillance capitalism, and the inbuilt, as I say, impetus to ever increasing the upskilling the technology needed for surveillance, and which has been exposed by Snowden and Assange, and that's why he's being victimised. And the ever-increasing sophistication of warfare, so drones coming from the sky and all the rest of it. We need to stand up against all this, and possibly biological warfare now. It's the new designer war. I mean, you can target people, you can knock out cities, etc. Horrific, what the world we're living in. Well, it's not good enough. And I do blame the military capitalist elites, probably, in my suspects list, because it's their business. So they want wars. Anyway, I'm putting all that into my commentary on Das Kapital. And then I mention all the publications I've done since moving here to France, which is quite a lot. I've given the whole list. And I do it partly just so I can keep track of them all. Like I did the book of Thomas's and bibliography on Mary Magdalene studies, etc. I did a new edition of the Saints and Sages book, which I'm going to end with. So there we are. And then finally I finish with a thing about my order of peace poets that I'm still running, and the commentary on the Dhammapada, which is a Buddhist text of profound wisdom. And Sangharakshita, one of the Buddhists I met and who influenced me when I was a teenager, said every word is true and it should be written on our hearts in letters of gold or fire. That was his view on the Dhammapada, and Sangharakshita was a wise man. And I finish with a list of all the European organisations involved in peace building. It's a sort of resource I've compiled. And there's some wonderful things going on in Europe. You see, what really annoys me about the anti-European rhetoric of Brexiteers is they don't realise how amazing European countries are and how much they're doing for peace. Obviously, we could be doing more, and that's why I want the European Union to create a mediation service. I know they will eventually, it's just taking a while to persuade them. At least Macron set up the Paris Peace Forum. Okay, so that's my newsletter. Those are the things. I think it's exciting. It keeps me busy here, and so lockdown is a time of intense work for me. It's not, God, what will I do next? Twiddle my thumbs. It's get on with all this stuff, because behind each of these things I mentioned is sometimes years of work and scores of people, activists and so on. Now, let me check that my cat has allowed me some here. Right. I want to finish with my saints of the day, because today is, like all days, a holy day. We've just had the equinox, which was, I celebrated by going to a local Druid beauty spot that I have close to where I live. And, because round here is exquisite countryside, oak forests, rivers. La Creuse River is just down the road, which is where I went. And I'm sure, tragically, some of the usual celebrations, like at Stonehenge, were cancelled this year because of the tragedy of coronavirus. So I would say to all my Druid friends and Christian friends around the world and other spiritual paths that now's the time to do really deep research into what's caused all this nonsense. That's why I've been sharing. So today we celebrate Marie Curie, a French-Polish scientist, 1867 to 1934. She was a devoted researcher in France, originally from Poland. She died of radium sickness caused by her scientific research into matter and radium.